There is just something about Halloween which seems to resurrect the inner child in many of us. From the trick-or-treaters to the costume parties to the scary tales that we gather round the campfires to tell. And yet there are some who see this type of behavior as merely whistling in the graveyard, as it were, doing our best to disguise our true fears and apprehensions about what Halloween truly signifies. For it is still the time of year when the nights grow longer, colder, and darker. And so we don our masks and appease these spirits with sweets, all the while safe in the conviction that we don't really believe in ghosts. Or do we? In Parkersburg, West Virginia, at least, there is one ghostly tale handed down through 5 generations which just might make you think twice. While most parapsychologists agree that cemeteries are actually illogical locations for hauntings, their atmosphere and character make connections with the paranormal all but unavoidable. Surrounded by the names and encapsulated life stories of the dearly departed, it is virtually impossible to escape the occasional icy chill down the spine. For a Mr. Crolley of Parkersburg, 2 warm summer nights in June of 1888 are said to have produced a little more than just a passing sensation of ice. According to legend, Mr. Crolley was one of only a handful of residents who had the misfortune of coming upon Parkersburg's own pair of ghostly apparitions, 2 spectral entities known only as the East End Ghouls. Parkersburg, West Virginia is located along the Ohio River, just above the point where it is joined in its westward journey by the Little Kanawha. Formerly known as Newport and chartered by the Virginia Assembly in 1820, Parkersburg became one of the first stops along the path of the great westward migration. Its awkward place in both West Virginia and American history was cemented very early on. In 1806, it became inexorably linked with the bizarre affair of the Burr Conspiracy, an ill-fated attempt by former Vice President Aaron Burr to establish a separate and independent nation to the south and west of the Ohio River by provoking an uprising in portions of North America still under Spanish control. Burr sought and received logistical and financial aid from a transplanted Anglo-Irish lawyer named Harmon Blennerhassett, who owned a sizable estate on an Ohio River island just west of Parkersburg. Eventually, Blennerhassett's island would become the de facto headquarters for Burr and his half-baked scheme. It was all over almost before it got started. Ohio Governor Edward Tiffin got word of Burr's plans and ordered the Ohio State Militia to raid the island. Burr and Blennerhassett managed to escape. Word soon reached President Jefferson, who ordered both Burr and Blennerhassett to be arrested. Both were eventually captured. Burr was tried for treason and acquitted. Harmon Blennerhassett was never indicted, but the reputations of both men were forever tarnished. Despite its quirky beginnings, Parkersburg prospered. With the arrival of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1857, it quickly began to develop into a sizable industrial center. The post-war boom in oil, timber, and natural gas only accelerated its growth. Situated at the point where the B&O main line from Baltimore to St. Louis crosses the Ohio River, Parkersburg became a vital link in the ever-expanding east-west flow of commerce. Founded in 1866, the Camden Consolidated Oil Company would soon come to dominate oil refining in the region. 9 years later, the enterprise became a part of J.D. Rockefeller's enormous Standard Oil Company. Parkersburg's path for the next century was solidified. The boom in oil and natural gas naturally brought with it a seemingly endless influx of new residents, many of them immigrants, resulting in an immense and ever-growing labor force. While oil, gas, and timber may have been the fuel of this economic explosion, the railroads, primarily the Baltimore and Ohio, were its wheels. It wasn't long before Parkersburg was crisscrossed this way and that by an interconnected series of side tracks, trestles, and freight lines. When viewed from above, this intricate system resembled an enormous hydra with a multiplicity of heads, snaking out in seemingly every direction. Given the closeness of the relationship between the city and the rails, it is perhaps not surprising that the legend of Holliday Cemetery and the East End Ghouls is directly indebted to the Baltimore and Ohio for its genesis. With its earliest burial dating to 1833, Holliday Cemetery, originally known simply as the Parkersburg City Cemetery, is located just north of the Little Kanawha River between 5th and 6th Streets. The high yards for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad were later set up just 2 blocks to the north and east. Something of an anomaly in 1800s America, railroads were, by their very nature, a round-the-clock operation. The setting of the sun in the west did not signal the end of the working day, but merely brought on an early incarnation of the night shift. Trains passed through at all hours, and the job of keeping them on time and literally on track required men to be at their respective posts 24/7. It was therefore quite normal for large shifts of workers to be as active as day laborers, while the majority of the region was fast asleep. According to the legend, a group of B&O workers were gathered at the East End rail yards one night in June of 1888 when their routine night shift took a bizarre turn. At some point around midnight, the workers, reportedly congregated around the coal chutes, were suddenly startled by the eerie sound of chains being rattled or dragged. Nearby, the men spotted what they described as the figure of a man, over 6 feet tall and draped in what looked like a funeral shroud. The entity, whatever it was apparently levitating a few inches above the ground and following the line of the nearby railroad tracks. Though it seemed to have no feet, the men also reported having heard the mysterious sound of footsteps, accompanied by what they later described as a deep, unearthly series of moans. Thoroughly spooked, the men took refuge behind some nearby containers. As they looked on, terrified, the entity continued to sway ever so slightly as it glided along the rails. To the men, the figure appeared to be heading towards what was then known as Rowland's Hotel or Boarding House, located just off the B&O property on George Street. Here, the entity paused, as though uncertain about what to do next. Having apparently made up its mind, it proceeded at a much faster pace in the opposite direction, back down the tracks and towards the Holliday Cemetery, after which it vanished in a whirl of smoke. The hour was late and the men near the end of their shifts, so many were quick to put the incident down to poor lighting and fatigue. The only problem? the bizarre series of events repeated each night during the final week of June. The otherworldly nature of the encounter aroused some interest, and the events witnessed by the workers were chronicled in one of Parkersburg's daily newspapers. In 1888, the spiritualist movement was still very much in vogue, and tales of paranormal occurrences were not at all rare, even if they did usually find themselves tucked away in Sunday magazine features or esoteric journals. While a healthy amount of skepticism permeated, it seemed that more and more were at least willing to give tales of ghosts and hauntings the benefit of the doubt. However, at least one Parkersburg resident was apparently not willing to take things at face value. He wanted to know what was going on. At the time, the press referred to him only as a Mr. Crolley and said that he was an employee of the Camden Consolidated Oil Company. Just how he became acquainted with the tales of the entity has become somewhat muddled over the decades. Some current accounts state that he read about the incidents in the local papers and then took it upon himself to investigate. Other versions state that he too was present late one night at the B&O rail yards and encountered the entities strictly by chance. According to the latter of the two accounts, Crolley came to the B&O yards late one night for either a business or a social visit. At around midnight, he left the yard by foot and began walking towards his home when he too encountered the shrouded entity, gliding along the nearby tracks in the general vicinity of the yard's coal chutes. Crolley also reported hearing the sounds of moaning, footsteps, and the rattling of chains, sounds which he reported echoed off the sides of the surrounding structures. Crolley stated that he observed the figure hover through the air and again towards the vicinity of the Rowland Hotel. The entity halted for a time in front of the hotel before again turning and heading back down the tracks in the opposite direction. His fear momentarily replaced by curiosity, Crolley followed along behind the entity, noting a strong, sickening odor, which he likened to the aroma of a funeral parlor. The entity was either unaware or unconcerned about Crolley's presence, as it never seemed to pay him any mind. When it reached the vicinity of the Holliday Cemetery, it again vanished. Apparently not satisfied with what he had witnessed, Crolley returned to the area the following night, reportedly sometime around 11 p.m. If Mr. Crolley was seeking to learn more, he was not to be disappointed. He again heard the sounds of footsteps and chains echoing off the facades of the surrounding buildings. Shortly thereafter, he spied the entity, again floating through the air towards the Rowland Hotel. According to published accounts, the entity once more hovered in front of the hotel for several seconds before again turning and floating away in the opposite direction. Reportedly not one to be easily frightened, Mr. Crolley this time gave chase. He pursued the entity down an alleyway and started to catch up with it. However, the hunter would soon become the hunted. The shrouded figure suddenly came to a halt, spun round on the spot, and charged straight for Mr. Crolley. Startled by the turning of the tables, Crolley himself did an about-face, dodged down another alleyway, and sped off towards the Holliday Cemetery. Crolley entered the grounds and took refuge behind one of the cemetery's large trees. His heart still in his throat, Crolley eventually mustered up the courage to peek out from behind the tree. He was reportedly stunned to see not one but two entities, both hovering above the ground and appearing to mirror one another's movements. His curiosity more than satisfied, Crolley broke from behind the tree and bolted, reportedly bound for the Rowland Hotel with the intention of sounding the alarm. The two entities followed him only as far as the entrance to the cemetery. Here they halted, hovered for a few seconds, and then vanished. Crolley's account of his bizarre encounters were also published in one of Parkersburg's daily newspapers. So, taking into account the passage of 133 years, just how well do the events relayed by Mr. Crolley and the railroad workers hold up when viewed through skeptical, fact-based lenses? Unfortunately, not so well. In 1888, the Baltimore and Ohio high yards were located here, just south of the main line, bound by George Street to the east, Depot Street to the south, and a residential neighborhood to the west. As can be seen on this 1877 map, Rowland's Hotel was located here at 402 George Street, just north of the main line. This Sanborn fire insurance map shows a detailed layout of the B&O rail yards as they appeared in 1889. Curiously, none of the wooden structures depicted are labeled as either coal chutes or tipples. While certainly not proof positive that they were not present, the same map section from 1914 clearly does indicate a coal tipple located on the eastern end of the yard. In 1889, this location would have been approximately here. However, it is other aspects of the tale's geography that often appear inconsistent with both locations and distances. In particular, Rowland's Hotel and the Holliday Cemetery are certainly not located in close proximity to one another. According to the legend, the entity is said to have hovered in front of Rowland's Hotel before making its way back down the tracks towards and eventually past the Holliday Cemetery. To do this, the entity would have had to have covered a distance of approximately 1/2 mile, even though it was said to have initially been moving at only a funeral pace. The location of Rowland's Hotel, or boarding house, is well documented, appearing first on the 1877 map. The U.S. Census for 1880 and 1900 list it as being located on George Street, detailed as house number 402 in 1900. Shown to have been a wood-frame structure, the Hotel Rowland also appears on the 1898 and 1904 edition of the Sanborn maps. The numerical designation is also the same, 402. Could Mr. Crolley and the railroad workers, perhaps confounded by low light and heightened fears, have simply named the wrong boarding house? Here again, maps from 1889, 1893, and 1898 indicate no other hotels or boarding houses in the area between the B&O yards and the Holliday Cemetery. They instead show only private dwellings and a grocery store located here, directly across the B&O side tracks from the West Virginia Oil Company. Several times so far we have made reference to low lighting conditions. But would the area necessarily have been draped in darkness, even around midnight? To test this theory, Mysterious WV documented the area well after the sun had set. Around Holliday Cemetery, the lighting is rather poor in places, as is the length of Harris Street between 6th and Depot. However, while homes and businesses are scarce today, the neighborhood in question was actually far more densely inhabited in 1888. In fact, of the 50-plus homes formerly located along Depot, Harris, and 6th Street, only 2 remain today. Would an area so full of homes, many of them being occupied by railroad workers, be completely dark at a time so close to a shift change? Curiously, some modern incarnations of the legend make reference to the Coffin House, a private dwelling where caskets for burial in the Holliday Cemetery were assembled. This, however, would have been an historical anachronism, as the well-known Coffin House, located at 520 Gale Avenue, had not even been constructed in 1888. Could the accounts have been referencing another residence, an 1888 equivalent of the Coffin House? And just who was the enigmatic Mr. Crolley? A search of the 1900 census turns up only one likely suspect in Wood County, a 41-year-old foreman named Andrew Crolley, residing at 111 7th Street in Parkersburg. Turning back the clock to 1880 only strengthens the case for Andrew, showing him working as an engineer and living along Marietta Avenue, very near the intersection with Harris Street, approximately here, just 2 blocks north of the Holliday Cemetery. While it may be a purely hypothetical exercise, the supernatural incidents themselves merit at least some analysis. What about the entities themselves? Sensational depictions aside, does their general description carry any credence? In actuality, yes. While the image of a ghost or specter clad in the proverbial white sheet has become almost comical, it is, in fact, a fairly logical description. This tale, unlike many others, goes to great lengths to emphasize that the white sheet reminded the witnesses of a funeral or death shroud, a curiously accurate description whose significance is often glossed over. Accepting for the moment the existence of spirits and phantoms, is it a stretch to believe that the last clothing or garment to cover their mortal remains could have been a white shroud? However corny or cliché it may sound, this, in fact, may actually be the most believable component of many supernatural tales, even if it does tend to conjure up humorous rather than frightening mental images. Although the accounts of the incidents have altered somewhat over the years, each retelling seems to contain 3 common threads: the B&O Rail Yard, the Rowland Hotel, and Holliday Cemetery. Aside from the fact that they are all located in the same general neighborhood, could there be any other connection between them? If the accounts are accurate, why did the entity seem so interested in the Rowland Hotel? Could it possibly have been the spirit of a former tenant and railroad worker, someone who was later buried in the Holliday Cemetery? Finally, is there any logical explanation for what Mr. Crolley and the other railroad workers might have seen? Could it have been a trick of the gaslight, an optical illusion heightened by late-night fog or haze? Could the men have been drunk or possibly hallucinating? Alas, this may be the one question to never be answered. Following Mr. Crolley's confrontation with the entities in late June of 1888, the creatures, later dubbed the East End Ghouls, were never seen again. Today, the Holliday Cemetery remains a fixture of Parkersburg's East End. The years, elements, and especially the vandals have not been kind. Many of its once elegant gravestones have been broken, destroyed, and even stolen. Its condition once deteriorated to the point that serious consideration was given to transforming it into a public park. Recent renovation efforts have succeeded in returning at least a modicum of dignity to the aged site. Its stone perimeter and verge are now in reasonably good order, and work is underway to repair ruptured sections of its outer wall. The former Baltimore and Ohio Yard also remains and is today owned and operated by the CSX Railway. One section of side tracks still branches off the main line and curves around Holliday Cemetery to the south. For the most part, activity in and around the yard is noticeably slower and quieter, yet every now and then the shrill whistle of a diesel locomotive will still split the air. If one is caught unawares, this could conceivably induce more fear than even the sight of a shrouded spirit or ghoul. The Rowland Hotel was destroyed sometime between 1904 and 1916. Today, its former location is occupied by the now defunct City Iron and Metal. A small portion of the original brick-paved street is still visible at its western edge. Virtually every residence in the neighborhood where these events are said to have taken place is now gone, including the former home of the once enigmatic Mr. Crolley. Andrew Crolley himself passed away on November 2, 1945. According to his death certificate, his last known employer was the Standard Oil Company, the entity which later purchased the Camden Consolidated Oil Company. Following Mr. Crolley's encounter in June of 1888, the East End Ghouls were, as far as we know, never seen again. Did the East End Ghouls really exist? Or was it just a legend? Another tale designed to keep children and perhaps even wandering husbands home at night? Just in case, should you find yourself on Parkersburg's East End late at night, it might not be a bad idea to keep both your eyes and your ears open. For it is just possible that ear-shattering screech you hear might not be an approaching train.